You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi everyone, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is about forgiveness. Is forgiveness a virtue? And do you need to forgive in order to really be free in your personal life? These are some questions that I've been thinking about, and I will share my thoughts with you in this episode. But before we get to that, I just want to say a big thank you to my new patrons on Patreon. So a big thank you to Kevin U, Steve W, and Anonymous. If you like this show and you would also like to support the show, you will get bonus episodes, my own Evernote templates for productivity, and many other rewards. So find out more about that at patreon.com/thevoluntarylife, or also on my website, thevoluntarylife.com, and I'll also put a link in the show notes. Alright, so on to this week's episode. If you're interested in personal freedom and personal development, and you've done any reading about this subject, you're bound to have come across discussions of forgiveness, and how important it is to forgive transgressions against you in your personal life in order to be free, and really to move on in life. Forgiveness, of course, is a religious virtue, especially for Christians, but it's not just spoken about within a religious context, although I do think that is a very important influence on where the idea about forgiveness being an important virtue comes from. I think the religious influence is important. But in general personal development circles, there is also a lot of talk about how you need to let things go for your own sake. Forgive and forget, move on. If you feel that somebody's wronged you sometime in the past, at some point you have to let go of your feelings of anger and move on. Otherwise, you're not going to be free in life. And I certainly think there's some truth in that, and I do understand that idea. But I also think there are some funny ideas around the idea of forgiveness, and that's what I'd like to talk about in this week's episode. There are two dictionary definitions of forgiveness, which is quite interesting. One is to stop feeling angry or resentful, and the other is to cancel a debt. And I think it's interesting and relevant that there are those two different definitions. The origin of the word forgive comes from Old English forgivan, which was to give, grant, or allow, or remit a debt, or to pardon an offence, and also to give up. I think one of the reasons why there is some confusion and different meanings around the word to forgive is because there's a lot of confusion about what to do in cases of someone having done something wrong against you. Let's not necessarily call it a crime, because I'm talking in this episode about personal life, but we can think about it in terms of somebody not fulfilling an obligation or doing something morally wrong against you. There's lots of conflicting ideas in our society about how justice should be done in those circumstances. There are different theories of justice. Although in general, I agree that it's not healthy to be consumed by anger, bitterness, and resentment, and it's positive to find a way to free yourself from continuing feelings of anger over past things that have happened to you. You want to move on at some stage in life, and I agree with that totally. However, there are some different interpretations about what forgiving means, and some of them I agree with and some of them I don't. So, for example, one sense in which I think it is good to forgive people is when you mean it in the sense that you acknowledge that they did something wrong and made it up to you. So, for example, if somebody borrows something of mine, like let's say they borrow my car or something, and they damage my car in some way, but they take responsibility for it, they get it fixed, and when they give it back to me, they say, look, I'm really sorry, but I dented the fender or bumper on the car, and so I took it to a repair shop and I got it replaced or fixed, and it's all better now. I'm really sorry that happened. Here's your car back. I think it's fair if they've done everything that they could do under the circumstances, and maybe even if they've gone out of their way to do something nice for you to compensate for the inconvenience of whatever damage they've done. At some point, if someone's made it up to you, then I think it's important to acknowledge that and not to harbour a grudge against somebody for something that they really have done everything they could to make up to you. That sense of forgiveness totally makes sense to me, that it's no help to you in your personal relationships to keep a chip on your shoulder about something that somebody really has made their very best efforts to make up to you and restore any damage that they've done and so forth. And an example of lending someone a car is like a physical example, but you can also say in a conversation with somebody, if someone says something hurtful and it's not said maliciously, but then maybe they just were a bit thoughtless and said something that was quite a hurtful comment, if they realize what they've said and then they apologize for it, take responsibility and make it up, then it is important to kind of acknowledge that somebody's doing their best efforts and have done everything that they reasonably can do to make it up to you and to restore the situation to whatever it was before. So that makes sense to me. You know, if someone does you wrong, but totally takes responsibility for it and makes up for it, then it's really important not to keep a chip on your shoulder. And that makes sense to me, not only in terms of my psychological well-being, but also in terms of my freedom. I don't want to carry a chip on my shoulder about things that have already been resolved. If you have a dispute with someone, but you resolve it fairly, then it should be done. You could also say, similar to this first definition of forgiveness, that there are times when it just makes sense to forgive someone if there's no real harm done in the first place. And this is forgiving in the sense of just not being petty about stuff. If someone's done something but it hasn't really damaged you, then making an issue out of it is kind of just making conflict when there doesn't need to be one. So I can agree with that kind of forgiveness too. That makes sense to me. Not to take offense at everything and see everything as a slight and so forth, and just basically not to make a big deal out of stuff when it doesn't need to be. The second kind of forgiveness is the kind of forgiveness where you forgive a debt, where you cancel a debt. And this is the kind of forgiveness that you do unilaterally without the other person making it up to you. I'll give you an example of this kind of forgiveness. When I started my business and we were still a very small, struggling consultancy unit, we were commissioned by a larger architectural practice to carry out a study for them for one of their projects. And to cut a long story short, we produced a great report, finished the project, client was very happy for it, and they just never paid us. We kept invoicing them, and they made various excuses, and the excuses changed over time, but they just wouldn't pay us. And we had to make a decision as to whether or not to take legal action against these people or to just cancel it as a bad debt. And it was that size of project where, although we hadn't been paid and that was a real hassle, it wasn't quite big enough to justify all of the hassle and expense and stress and trouble of trying to pursue legal action to get the money from this company that was simply refusing to pay us. And ultimately, we decided to write off the debt, to cancel the debt. And it made sense to us, not because we didn't think that we were justified in invoicing for the money, and not because we thought it was okay for this other company not to pay us, but we just recognized at some point we have to cut our losses and move on because we have too much to do and there are too many important things for us to prioritize that chasing after this relatively small invoice is not worth our time. So we wrote off that bad debt because essentially it would have cost us more grief to keep chasing it than it did to just write it off. So as another example of this kind of forgiveness, if you have an irresponsible friend who you lend money to, you can keep hassling that friend about the money. But if your friend keeps putting you off and giving you excuses and so forth, at some point, it's more grief to you to chase this person than just to write it off. And of course, irresponsible people know this, which is why they make it very difficult for you to collect debts from them, because they're hoping that at some stage it'll be too much hassle for you. So you forgive that debt in the sense, not that you say it's okay that you're not paying me back or that you haven't made it up to me, but you forgive it in the sense that you say, I'm letting go. I'm not going to chase justice for myself in this case any longer because it's not worth it to me. And that is a kind of forgiveness that I also think is rational and makes really good sense in life. If you have a conflict with someone and you believe that this person has treated you unfairly or has done an injustice against you or owes you in some way or whatever it is, if you try and resolve it with that person, and it becomes increasingly obvious to you that you're never going to get justice from this person, they're never going to make it up to you for whatever reason. Maybe it's because they don't want to, or they refuse to acknowledge that they should make it up to you, or whatever the reason is. At some point, it really makes sense to just give up and let it go. And in a sense, you forgive that person the debt that you think they owe you, whether it's a real financial debt or whether we're talking about they owe you some other kind of restitution that's more psychological or whatever. You just stop chasing it. That also makes total sense to me. But there's a third kind of forgiveness that doesn't make sense to me. And this third kind of forgiveness is the kind of forgiveness where you're supposed to say, this person has treated me badly or done me wrong. They're never going to make it up to me for whatever reason. They're not capable, or they can't acknowledge it, or whatever. And I am going to ignore all of that and pretend like it didn't happen. I'm going to forgive and forget and just accept the injustice that has been committed against me. To use the examples that I've given, if I were to apply this third kind of forgiveness to that company that wouldn't pay our invoice, that would be to say we write off the invoice and we just carry on working with them as if nothing happened and just move on and forget about it. That's not what we did. When we wrote off that bad debt, we never worked with that company again. And we didn't do anything to help them. We didn't do any partnering with them or anything like that. We didn't try and go out and harm them, but we certainly didn't work with them again. And in the same way, if you lend a friend of yours money and they just won't pay you back, at some point it makes sense just to give up and forgive the debt. But I don't think it makes sense to forgive that friend in the sense that you just pretend it didn't happen and keep on lending them money. And this sense of forgiveness, I think, also applies to emotional situations. If you have a difficult history with people in your family, your parents, for example, your brother and sister, or whatever, bad things that happened in the past, things that you feel were unjust, and you try and talk to people in your personal life about these things, if you realize at some point they're never going to make it up to you, whatever it is that you think they owe you, then I do think you have to let it go and just move on in life, because it doesn't help you and doesn't help your freedom to stay seething in anger at this person and just feel bitter about all the things that happened to you. But at the same time, it doesn't mean you have to be all smiles and hugs around people who've treated you badly and have not made up for it. I can understand the benefit of not staying bitter, but I think moving on often means that you have to say, well, I'm not going to lend this person money anymore. Or in your personal life, I'm not going to hang out with people who really have behaved really badly towards me in the past. Yes, I'm going to give up on the hope that they'll ever acknowledge it or take responsibility for their actions, but it doesn't mean that you have to pretend like it never happened. I don't see how that third kind of forgiveness really helps you achieve more freedom. So I think forgiveness is a tricky subject. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Does it make sense to you, the different kinds of forgiveness that I've outlined? And what do you think the role of forgiveness is in achieving personal freedom? Let me know what you think. That's all for this week. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.